Right, so Israel, seemingly on cloud nine after the success of their disgusting pager attack and their taking out of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, felt Lebanon had been sufficiently softened up for their next invasion. Their escalation of the wider war so desperately sought by Benjamin Netanyahu, as Western leaders continue to delude themselves that he still wants peace and would still meaningfully work towards a ceasefire. Well, as the old Star Wars adage goes, your overconfidence is your weakness, as Israel have had an absolute pasting at the Lebanese border, having failed to make any real progress in their ground invasion, and as a result have done what they've done previously when militarily frustrated, when rendered impotent by a better trained, less immoral force, not that that is a high bar, and gone and bombed civilian areas and attacked someone else besides, because that is functionally just how out of control Israel is in Netanyahu's desperation to make this a war Israel cannot win, and drag the US and likely others into a formal war against their enemies too. Right, so Israel have not had a successful time of it trying to get into Lebanon, across the border, violating UN resolutions against such a course of action. But this is an out-of-control state, led by an out-of-control despot who is becoming ever more desperate and ever more unhinged in all of the warfare he is conducting, all the strikes he is making and the sheer number of targets he's choosing to engage with as well. Israel has become an absolute pariah on the world stage, except among too many nations' bought and paid for leaders. But if they are considered a pariah by the likes of you and I, can you imagine what those living in the Middle East under the shadow of Israeli atrocity are calling them? Well, we know what Israel call them all, don't we? Amalek, a biblical reference to excuse the genocide of such people as if their deaths were as ordained as Israel's apparent right to the lands they occupy. Every person, every nation Netanyahu refers to as Amalek is justification in his warped mind for genocide. If that were actually true, though, and his beliefs justified, you'd imagine he'd be having better luck than he is, with divine right upon his side, but of course it is all in his own fevered mind. He might imagine everything was lining up perfectly. A pager attack with explosives that I imagine has now also killed off Israel's tech industry, because who the hell wants a piece of that now? He might have hoped would have taken out a number of Hezbollah operatives, though, a project apparently some 15 years in the making, we're told that was now. And then, of course, there was the successful assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, which also cost the lives of some 2,000 innocent Lebanese civilians. But I suppose they were all Amalek too, right? All justified in his mind. Since September 20th, Israel has destroyed or damaged some 3,100 buildings in Lebanon and displaced 1 million people from their homes, just as we saw happen in Gaza City in the early days of the Gaza invasion by Israel following the night of October 7th. Thousands are dead, and still the West supports Israel. Bought and paid for politicians do anyway. Most of the general public in such countries do not. Well, if all of that could be chalked up as a success for Netanyahu, for everything panning out exactly as he had foreseen, to shoehorn in another Star Wars reference, things have suddenly come to a grinding halt for him as far as actually getting Israeli boots on the ground in are concerned. The ground invasion greenlit by Joe Biden's US administration has stalled somewhat as the overconfidence of Israeli forces has instead led to some 60 members of the IDF being killed by an unexpectedly still well-organised Hezbollah, who have now been officially joined by the Lebanese army itself on Lebanon's border. You see, for as much as the West likes to sell Hezbollah as a bunch of terrorists, they actually are part of the Lebanese political picture too, an inconvenient truth for much of our media and our politicians. And as much as focus to sell that viewpoint is focused on the militant arm of that group, there are politicians there as well. Hezbollah are a political party with 13 seats currently in the Lebanese legislature. So it's not really a surprise to see government institutions such as their army alongside them, even if that comes as a shock to the West, and they might view such an occurrence as proof of Lebanon's broken state mentality by Western standards. It simply isn't the case. The opposite is very much true. And the organisation seen to repel the Israeli invasion ought to be seen as proof of that. But coming back to Israel's overconfidence in their attack on Lebanon and their belief it to be a walk in the park with their leadership and key figures they believed leaving them in disarray, the fact remains that it has been nearly 20 years since Israel and Lebanon were formally at war. Many in the IDF today, young as they tend to be, have never fought in Lebanon. And everything they knew about fighting in Lebanon, they had basically read in a book. As this excerpt from the Lebanese Arabic language newspaper, thank goodness for Google Translate, Al Akbar, explains. The soldiers who belong to the special forces know about Lebanon. It is true that most of them have never fought here before, but in their military lessons there is a major course called The War with Lebanon. Despite this, they underestimated that the advance would only require some armoured vehicles. However, what happened is that the soldiers advanced hours apart on the three axes, only to encounter various ambushes in which the resistance fighters used explosive devices and regular and guided rockets, in addition to mortar shells and direct artillery, while the resistance forces were shelling the rear areas from which the soldiers came, or from which support was expected to come. The result was the deaths and injuries of about 60 officers and soldiers, while the results of the night's confrontation near Aitarun yesterday were not yet clear. In practice, what happened yesterday indicates several things. First, the resistance groups deployed in the front line area did not leave their positions, despite being subjected to bombing and air pursuit for 360 days. This is what the Hebrew media mentioned yesterday, when it indicated that the town where the Israeli forces were ambushed, Edessa, had been subjected to 650 raids during the past months. It also indicates that the resistance's plans and estimates of the enemy soldiers' movements were accurate, and that it used the appropriate weapons required on the ground to disrupt the hostile operation and break the arrogance that controlled the enemy's leaders and soldiers. In essence, Hezbollah didn't, in a practical military sense, bat an eyelid at the atrocities Israel had committed against them over the past year while they've been supporting Hamas, supporting the people of Gaza against the Israeli atrocity there. Despite the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah and the taking out of 2,000 innocent civilians along with him, the bombing in Beirut, the use of white phosphorus now in Beirut, a chemical weapon attack on a city, a heavily populated area, a war crime as that is. But because Lebanon stood firm and stuck to their plans, their strategies, they saw Israel coming, overconfident, and have completely embarrassed them on three fronts, all of which they got rapidly repelled over, and where they lost 60 of their troops. That will be seen as a complete failure by Israel because, and there's plenty of documentary evidence of this now, how Israel measures success can be easily explained by the Iranian attack just the other day, where Israeli media jeered and laughed at Iran because their airstrike failed to kill a single Israeli civilian. As we subsequently found out, though, Iran once again targeted 3 military installations. They never targeted civilian areas at all. Now look at those 2,000 people killed in order to get to Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon. And you have to realize that actually, Israel measure their military success by how many civilians they actually end up killing. And then think about all the people we've seen sniped while standing in the street doing nothing over the last year in Gaza or the West Bank. And it was a chilling realization on my part, when it finally dawned on me, that this is literally how Israel measure their success, and yet still claim to have the most moral army in the world. It is the most immoral, evil army in the world, by some distance, if this is how Israel measures its success. And that is a direct reflection on all those voicing support for this genocidal regime as well. As we saw, after Iran hit Israel, though, Israel hit someone else, out of frustration, seemingly. They struck Syria. They hit that Russian airbase. And now Russia have apparently been telling their people to get out of Israel, get out of Lebanon, get out of the Middle East. Putin allegedly snubbing a call from Netanyahu following that strike, which doesn't bode well for Israel at all by the look of it. But following this failure in Lebanon, last night Israel launched the biggest assault on the West Bank in 20 years, a massive airstrike that has killed 18 people. And again, I will point you to the target, which was once again a civilian target. They again have struck a refugee camp, just as they did in Jenin some weeks ago. This time they hit Tulkarem. On top of that, those 1 million people displaced in Lebanon who have been fleeing towards the Syrian border for their safety, well, Israel targeted that border region last night as well, targeting displaced Lebanese civilians fleeing. You'll note that Keir Starmer hasn't rushed to a podium right now or following this to condemn Israel, of course. He won't be either. The human rights lawyer who is on the side of a vile entity that intentionally targets civilians, whilst he only condemns those who attack military targets instead, it seems, because they aren't insane like Netanyahu is, leading a nation that measures success in collateral damage in innocent lives that to them are all Amalek and therefore do not matter. Meanwhile, as Russia pulled their people out of the Middle East, some 1.5 million Russians incidentally live in Israel, apparently. It begs the question of what price Netanyahu may now pay by striking Russia. For as much as Russia seems to be preoccupied with their invasion of Ukraine, Israel's attack on their airbase in Syria is an historic first, and Well, Putin isn't known for his forgiveness, is he? Has Israel made a fatal miscalculation here? Get the details of that story on this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Stick with the channel some more, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.